So now we're going to take off the lock ring and the main adjusting nut from the end of the long main shaft. And I do that with a round end pointed punch. I lay it right against one of the notches on the lock ring. And you take the lock ring off counterclockwise, the normal way. And then the big adjusting nut on the end, I just use a crescent wrench. Turn it loose like so. And the big adjusting nut comes out. And the roller bearing, one of the two roller bearings that's on the worm gear on the main shaft, is visible right here in its race. If you'll notice, there's no gasket or sealing device to protect the oil from coming out around the spiral of the threads and leaking on the end here. They don't have any sealing device. We're going to seal this with thread compound when we put it back together so that no oil can come out of there. But the factory didn't really do that. There's the original roller bearing, and the race is in here. We're going to discard those because we're going to put new ones in. And we will now see if we can wipe this up and inspect this a little bit. This big end cap and the race that's inside of it. And there's the race for the roller bearing right there. One of the two races that are identical. So we'll put this in the washing basket. And in here we have, of course, the main shaft with the worm gear on the lower end of it. We're going to go up to the other end and remove the steering wheel that I had placed on there. And we're going to tap the main shaft downward using a plastic hammer. And we might have to lift a little bit on the worm gear. And there it is. So here comes the worm gear out of here. And it'll have the upper bearing that's just above the worm gear right here, if you can see that. There's the upper roller bearing. And you can see that grease has been installed in this thing in such a way that it's pushed it up this far up the shaft. There is no seal between the upper bearing and the long mast jacket. So oil or grease can go and migrate up there if it there's a lot placed in the gearbox like this one, or should you park a car, one of these early Corvettes, on a hill with the engine, the nose of the car facing at a steep angle upward, the liquid from the steering gearbox can run all the way up the tube and drip onto the carpet of the car. So it's good to not overfill the steering gearbox, since on a real hot day when the hypoid grease in there is very liquid, it's possible for it to literally run up and get on your left sock. If you wonder how I know it gets on your left sock, you could take a guess, because it happened to me many years ago, back in the 60s. Anyway, we wipe this off a little bit, and we'll have a look at the worm gear and see how it is. There's the races for the roller bearings, one on the bottom end of the worm gear and one up on the top end. And I see quite a bit of marking on this upper one. There are some definite lines in the race area from this upper bearing. It looks like maybe some moisture got in here at one time and caused a little rusting to take place. Once again, as you can see, I use a lot of paper towels. It seems that they're a convenient way to clean it up as you go a little bit, because there's so much oil and grease in these things. When you open them up, it becomes quite a big part of the job is to contain all this stuff. And I don't like walking around in it if it drips on the floor, so I try to keep a little bit of a control over the messiness of it. Like so. Now there's a possibility that one could reuse the original worm gear and sector roller if they happen to be in very good condition. However, it's been my experience that only one out of every maybe 20 or 25 gearboxes has a good enough worm gear and sector roller and bearings and such that you'd want to put it back in there again, especially since removal of this from the car is quite a big job and time consuming. Most people only want to do it once, and you really only have to do it once if you do it properly, because they really are very well designed and will last many years. Almost all of these that I rebuild have never been apart before. Very few of these I've ever taken apart that were apart before. And the ones that I have taken apart that were apart before, may I say, shouldn't have had to come apart. Had they been done really right, they would have been okay. So there's that. I'm going to pull the shaft clear out of the mast jacket, wiping it off a little as I go. And there then is the upper end where the steering wheel hooks on, with the splines and the threads for the steering wheel nut. And if you'll notice, I don't know if you'd be able to see this or not, but located in the upper end of this is a hash mark, like the hands of a clock. And the original steering shafts had a hash mark, which helps you to align the worm gear and the steering wheel and everything properly when you put it all back together again. And we'll talk more about that when we build the thing back up with the new parts. So here we have now the worm gear with the main shaft out of the steering gear box and wiped off a bit. And here we have our sector shaft with sector roller. And I wanted to illustrate a little bit about this. This is properly called an hourglass worm gear. And actually you can see how it's kind of shaped like an hourglass. It's narrow in the middle. The sector roller rolls through the worm gear back and forth, creating the turning motion that you need for your wheels. And it's designed in such a way that there is a point of more resistance to turning that exists right in the center of its motion. In other words, this thing is easy to turn when it's off center, either to the right or the left. That is to say, if it's unimpeded, if you just have the steering gearbox separate from the car, it's not connected to the car or the wheels, it's just in like a holding jig like I have here, and you turn the steering wheel, it's very easy to turn and spins freely when it's either right or left of center. But when you get right in the very middle of its motion, at the very center point, you will notice a little resistance to turning. And it's right there in the center of its motion where you need to have this exist when you're going straight down the road. So it's one of the very most important things about this is that when you're all finished and it's together and you're driving, when you're going straight and the wheels are straight and the steering wheels is straight and everything, that this sector roller is right in the very center of its motion, at the high point, or the point where there's a little bit of resistance to turning. At that point, there will be no play anywhere between the steering wheel and the rubber tire. Virtually no play, not any, not an eighth of an inch. And if you have it set up properly, it will perform that way, and you will have no wander. Wander is where you're driving along and you find it difficult to stay in your lane because the car wants to go to the right, let's say, so you turn to the left, but it still wants to go to the right, so you turn further to the left. Finally, you get it back to the left, and now it wants to go to the left, and you're pulling it back to the right. Wander takes the fun out of driving. If the steering is working properly, you won't even ever have to think about staying in your lane, because with one hand on the steering wheel, your brain will automatically keep you dead straight in the lane, and you'll have no problem just enjoying the ride. You can listen to the radio, you can talk to your companion, and never even think about it. That's called zero wander. It's very important. And one of the things that happens to these old Corvettes and a lot of other cars with an hourglass worm gear is when they get to be in a bad operating condition, you have this bad case of wander. Another big problem that happens with these is what I call a catch in the steering. When you're turning the wheel through a corner, the steering wheel all of a sudden gets hard to turn, and you have to pull it harder to get it past the catch. That condition is caused by different things, but primarily it's caused by what we call galling, where one of the case-hardened surfaces in the sector roller or in the worm gear becomes galled or degraded, like this place right here. Can you see that? There's a spot in this is not the one we took out of this car, but another one that I did recently. There's a galling, and when this roller comes to that place, you'll feel a catch and you'll have to push it through. Here's one with a lot of galling around about half the diameter of this roller face. You can see the galling and the wear all around in there. I hope you can see it with the camera. Here's on the other side of it, there's another significant patch and a little patch starting right there. In these places, the case hardening of the face of this sector roller wheel, the case hardening has broken down, and we're now rolling on the softer metal that's under the case hardening, and we have this condition where it's going to be not only very loose with a lot of wander, but also you'll have a catch in the steering.